So hi everybody and welcome to Open Democracy's live discussion. My name is Caroline Molloy and I am the editor of Open Democracy's UK section. Just to say that we do want this, really pleased that you can all join us, and we want this discussion to involve all of you as much as possible. So particularly thank you to all of those who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We've had quite a lot this week and we're going to address as many of them as we can. If you are joining us on Zoom and if you have a question or a comment for the panel, do click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window, and I will endeavour to pick up as many of those as I can. People watching on Facebook can also put their questions in comments. So today we're going to be asking the question, where next for Labour? Last week, as we know, the Labour Party suffered across England and Scotland, losing the Hartlepool by-election, a swathe of council seats and control of 8 English councils. It also got its lowest ever vote share in a Scottish Parliament election. I've also seen opinion polling out by Comrades today which say that 3 in 5 people say that Labour has lost its way, and a similar proportion are saying that Labour has lost its way amongst those who voted Labour in 2019. So what does the future hold for Labour? How should it respond to this set of circumstances? As I said, we've had probably more questions than we would usually have from people in advance on this topic. It's obviously the question on many of our readers' lips. We know, I think, what the right wing of the party's answer is. So Tony Blair was writing in the New Statesman this week, suggesting a very heavy turn to sort of technological solutions as the main way forward for the Labour Party to embrace. Peter Mandelson has also been writing in a similar vein, but also with quite a heavy emphasis on ending the power of what he terms the union barons in the party. So we've seen those messages coming out from the right of the party. I think today, I hope the panelists will be happy to be characterised, or maybe not, as radical progressives. I think we want to hear from this wing of the party as to what the future might hold. Blair said that what he termed radical progressives were not sensible. So it will be interesting. Hopefully we will have some sensible suggestions coming through today. I am joined today, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 eminent panelists. So we have Clive Lewis. Clive, as I'm sure you know, is the Labour MP for Norwich South and was a leadership contender in the last leadership election. We also have Maddie Kirkman, who is joining us from Scotland. Maddie is a disability rights and tenants union activist. She was the constituency candidate for Labour in the Lothians. I've fluffed that, haven't I, Maddie? She was the constituency candidate for Labour in Edinburgh Central and also a list candidate in the Lothians in the Scottish Parliament elections. And I'm delighted we're also joined by Jeremy Gilbert. Jeremy is an academic in cultural and political theory, a writer, researcher, and activist. So welcome all. Thank you very much for joining us today. I suppose, you know, what's gathered us here today is that it has been, I think, fairly unanimously perceived as a pretty grim week for Labour. The party seems to be fighting a never-ending internal war. When we promoted this event, we kind of phrased it in our tweets as, you know, what's the future for Labour? And we have to say we had quite a lot of responses saying there is none. What future for Labour? So does Labour have a future? As people have responded to us, I'm going to kick off by asking you, and how have we even got to the point where people are posing that question? So, and I'm going to start by turning to you, Clive.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's always good to be introduced by your greatest failure as well, as a former would-be leadership contender.
Much more I could say, Clive, much more.
Yeah, no. So I think the fact, yeah, you kind of touched on it. The fact that we're having this conversation means that there are obviously deep concerns and problems for the future of, I wouldn't say just the Labour Party in this country, although I'm clearly concerned with that, as are most of the people who are watching and taking part today. But it's for social democracy around the world. I mean, you know, I'll very quickly say a lot of people are looking over at Biden in the US, and there are a lot of good and interesting things that are happening in the US. But do I think that a kind of a revived Republican Party is no longer a threat because of Joe Biden and what he's putting in place? Unfortunately not, because I don't think they're going to go far enough or deep enough, and America's too divided. So we can say that there is a real issue with social democracy around the world, democratic socialism, however you want to describe it, but definitely social democracy. And I think there's lots of reasons why it's happening here, but I think, if you're looking at the kind of bigger structural issues, our Labour Party was set up 100 years ago in a very specific set of conditions with a very specific political culture and an economy, which Marx obviously wrote about, an industrial economy and so on and so forth. And we're now entering into a new phase of what you would call post-capitalism, potentially. Not everyone buys into that, but we're clearly on the cusp of substantial technological change, but also a climate crisis, the change on the cusp of biological changes in terms of the biological sciences. I think someone described it as the Black Death, the Ice Age, and the Industrial Revolution all rolled into one. I think it was our colleague Neil Lawson that said that, and I think he's right. And we're kind of trying to fight, deal with, 21st century issues and changes with a kind of 19th century toolbox. And frankly, it's not fit for purpose. And here in the UK, I would argue, in Westminster elections, it's being held together by a combination of faith and first past the post. And the reason I say faith is because I think there's too many people inside my party and too many colleagues. I'm not going to name them. I think it's kind of almost a collective mentality inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, but also inside the party. You will hear from Jeremy probably the term Labourist, this kind of concept that only Labour can advance progressive politics in this country. But there's a sense that support for Labour is a physical reality, like gravity. Like if I step off a building, I know whether I believe in gravity or not, I'll probably plunge to the bottom of that. I will plunge to the bottom of that building. Not probably, I will. I know that. But I think I think the Labour Party's vote is like money. People think it's real, but actually it isn't. It's an act of faith. Money is an act of faith. The fact that the bank will pay you back, will pay someone else back, that you will pay your debt back. That's what we should see our vote as, and it's not a physical reality. And I think now, looking at the so-called foundation seats, people are beginning to understand that the Labour vote is not a physical, objective reality. It will not always be there. The Labour Party does not have a God-given right to exist. And I think that's causing problems for our party as we begin to reflect on the fact that seats that we thought were pretty much unscalable by the Tories are now falling away. And that's creating, I think, an existential angst. And as you touched on, some people are saying that the Labour Party should hark back to the 1990s, that kind of technocratic, technological determinist way forward that Tony Blair is advocating, which is basically that you can't change anything. All you can do is ride the tiger. Well, we might just give up and go home. I mean, I think, that will be very tempting for some people. It's comforting. It's something that people understand. When things, we kind of feel that we've been here before in the Thatcher years. If we go back to a variant of centrism, of what Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson and others in the party are advocating, we'll somehow find a magic formula where we can win again and things get slightly better. But if you think about the problems that New Labour baked in, they are part of the reason why we are where we are. Yes, it did good, but it also, the road ahead is paved with good intentions, and it laid the seeds of our own, of what's happening in the Red Wall now, what's happening to the Labour Party. So I think the Labour Party does have problems. I'll shut up now. I hope we can begin to unpick what they are and how we begin to solve them. But yeah, I think, we're in a mess, and how we get out of it is going to require radical thinking, not going back to the past and some kind of comfort food thought thinking.
Thanks very much, Clive. I think that we will definitely come back to some of those issues that you raised, and the idea of the Labour vote as a kind of physical presence that can be depended on. I'm definitely wanting to ask you all to say a little bit more about the issues around Labour's base in a moment. But Jeremy, just over to you with that kind of opening question. How have we got to the point where people are asking if Labour's got a future, and does it?
Well, I think the essential problem for the Labour Party right now is that there are two sets of things it could do. It could carry on behaving in the way it's been behaving for the past year, and the way in which the kind of right wing of the party and most of the party bureaucracy and a big chunk of the parliamentary party want to behave. And that is a way which is oriented towards one objective, and that is the objective of them retaining their positions within the institutions and bureaucracy of the party and retaining their seats where they're safe seats. And there's another set of things it could do, which might actually make it a kind of viable and vital sort of political force, but they're not the same things. Because that, it would have to, it was very clear from the results. I'm not hardly the first person to observe this, that Labour did well where it could enthuse it of its vote by presenting a kind of radical political agenda, especially where, we'd seen sort of municipal Corbynism in action. Incredible article by Helen Pidd at The Guardian, like picking out all these places where Labour had done well, not mentioning that they were all Corbynites, all places with Corbynite councils, not mentioning that Helen Pidd, who's done so much to promote the idea that Labour ought to be adopting this kind of blue Labour project in order to appeal to the so-called working class, so there's a real problem, but she didn't do her job as a political journalist by pointing out that all of the people she was saying were demonstrating had done well for Labour were doing so by pursuing exactly the sort of municipal socialism that was associated with the kind of radical wing of Corbynism, and about which Tony Blair was being so categorically dismissive. But that is the case. That is the empirical fact to which he was pointing to in that article. That was the case, and it's been very widely observed. But the point is, those are places where the kind of right wing of the party and its kind of factional organisations and its staff either haven't, for historical, accidental reasons, haven't been strong recently, or they've been actively displaced. They've been successfully displaced by other people, and anywhere where that hasn't happened, Labour is sinking. Labour is just dying. And I think, the problem for Labour is there's a whole bunch of people in positions of power in the party who basically, if it's a choice between letting the party die, as long as they get to stay in charge of it until it's time to draw their pensions, and doing anything that will be necessary to save the party, they're going to choose, course A. And it's only very, very politically engaged kind of even sections of the membership who understand this, for precisely the reason I've just given, that even the main news source they look to tell them about what's going on in the party, which is The Guardian, doesn't tell them. The opinion desk tells them, but the news desk has a studious policy of not telling them, not giving them an accurate picture of this kind of factional politics in the party. And so it's only the kind of very, very engaged membership who read Labour List who actually know that all this is going on. And that's the problem. That's the fundamental problem for the party, really. I think, and I think the answer to the question, does it have a future, really depends upon whether the forces which would like to do the things that could save it are able to win enough support and get enough exposure for their ideas, and conversely, whether the section of the party's kind of bureaucracy and the very large number of its elected representatives in Parliament and local councillors who really ultimately would rather just let it die as long as they're in charge of the dying process, get to have their way.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I know you wrote about this for Open Democracy recently, and that some of the links to Open Democracy articles will appear in the chat down the side. And as I say, just to remind people as we go along, I'm going to come to you, Maddie, in a moment, but just to remind people as we go along that please do put questions in the side. I can see that that has already started, so that's great. We did have some questions actually, Jeremy, addressing exactly that point that you make about the behaviour of not just the right-wing MPs, but the right-wing bureaucracy within the party. And I think someone asked, do they realise the risks inherent for them in sort of attempting to destroy the party? So some are witnessing this, but I think your point is very well made about the way this is covered in much of the media and the points that are not being made. But Maddie, I want to turn to you. Obviously, from a really interesting to get the Scottish perspective on, do you think that Labour is dead in England, and in what way? So this is quite a big question, I suppose, but do you think it's dead in England from your perspective north of the border, and How do you see that linking up with the party's current prospects in Scotland?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on what you define as the Labour Party, because I think that there will always be a Labour Party, because the Labour movement and the trade union movement will always need a conduit for political representation. So the question is whether or not the current machinery of the Labour Party as we know it is fit for achieving that. And I think, under its current leadership, it's proven in England, perhaps especially that it isn't, and that it's not willing to be that. And I think that to some extent, where we go next with that idea of the Labour Party playing that role depends on the kind of post-Corbyn membership, because obviously we saw a huge influx of members under Corbyn's leadership who were very enthused by him as an individual and the manifestos that were put forward at that time, but was enough political education and engagement done to encourage those people to understand the broader purpose of the party and the broader kind of historical purpose of the party? Or are those people just going to leave because these leaders and these manifestos no longer represent us? So I think that there is work to do by members who stay in order to continue to talk about trade unions and to talk about movements outside of the party, and to attempt to recapture that narrative and to some extent the machinery of the party, so that the party can return to those roots. But then additionally, kind of from the Scottish perspective, it's a really big question. What is the future of the Labour Party in Scotland? And it is tied up with what is the future of Scotland, because we know that independence is on the cards or on the table. And we know that the political landscape will shift massively in that process, both in terms of splits within parties, and if there were to be an independent Scotland, we know that the SNP will dissolve, but the machinery of that party and the members and the individuals involved in that party aren't just going to disappear. So where are they going to go? Is Labour going to embarrass itself so much that it no longer has a platform? Will it still have the respect of the trade union movement through a referendum process? I'm not so sure. And then that begs the question, where is the UK Labour Party left without Scotland? And these are all different strands of questioning that we could pursue, but are things that I would like members across the UK to take seriously in really understanding what has happened to Scottish Labour internally and in the way that it's viewed by the public as a lesson to us all in terms of what happens when you swerve to the right and when you get in bed with the Tories, but also in terms of what is happening to our constitution and to the nature of our country, let alone the parties that are operating within it.
I should say to the panelists as well, I mean, I'm going to come on to, thank you very much. I think you're all raising, I'm going to come on to readers, some of the readers' questions that were submitted and that are beginning to come in a moment. But if you have points that you want to respond to in what each other's saying at any point, because you're all raising excellent questions as well, please do indicate to me and I will aim to facilitate that. Clive, you wanted to come back.
There's a question from Michael Amory, which is, hi everyone, I hope you're all well. Dialing in from Rainy Stretton. Clive described the challenges facing Labour as systemic or structural, whereas Jeremy has described those challenges as the product of individual choices and internal political battles. Can both be right? Yes, because the changes that are taking place kind of within this country, whether it's the balkanization of the United Kingdom in the kind of post-imperial period, or whether it's the kind of changing nature of the working class and how that's been divided, and we can talk about that, between those who have property, investments, and pensions, and those who don't. And, these are all part of the structural changes, but it's about, will the party's structures and those individuals allow that political realignment that needs to take place? The reason the Tory party have been the most dominant political force in arguably Western Europe for centuries is because they have adapted and changed according to the needs of, as they see, their class or the political interest that they represent. And Labour, I think what you're seeing under Boris Johnson is in part that quite fundamental shift away from a kind of neoliberal consensus. And Labour under Corbyn, I think, post 2008, it tried to shift and to realign, and it wasn't allowed. The kind of countervailing forces stopped it, whether it was the media, the establishment, our own MPs, the bureaucracies within the Labour Party. Those structures didn't allow that to happen. It didn't happen. It also made mistakes, and it didn't happen. And now we're paying a price for that. So there's a choice before the movement, before the members, before the institutions, before the MPs, before Keir Starmer. Do they want to adjust to be able to face the structural reality of that change structural reality, or do they want to carry on off that cliff edge? And history is littered with political parties that thought they had a right to exist and are now footnotes in history books. And I think the Labour Party needs to understand that yes, there will always, as long as there are jobs in the economy, and depending on who you listen to, Paul Mason or John Cruddas, there's a little bit of tension there. But for as long as there are jobs in the economy, there will need to be representation of those people. Whether it's the Labour Party in its current brand and form and structures is another matter.
Thank you very much, all of you, for that. I'm just going to come to one of the questions we've had from readers, which I think picks up on the point you were just making, Clive, about what happened to the Corbyn project over the last few years, and also, Maddie, what you were talking about in terms of organising in communities. So this question, which we had various questions along this line, this one, I have to say, felt like a bit of a cry from the heart, and one that I could relate to and have heard from many friends, which is why should progressive people bother involving themselves with Labour politics when even Corbynism didn't work? And so, Jeremy, I'm going to come to you, I think, with that. And I'm also going to just insert a supplementary question, which I don't know if that will help or hinder, which seemed in a similar vein, which was, so why should we even bother? Corbynism didn't work is one question. And what can be done to create community organisations on the scale of the thousands who went canvassing for Jeremy Corbyn, which I know is something had some involvement with?
Well, I'm going to give the same answer I always give to this. Look, the only appropriate attitude for any sort of someone who thinks of themselves as a progressive or a radical to have to the Labour Party is it is a neutral terrain of struggle. Okay, it is not something you should make an emotional investment in. You shouldn't think of the Labour Party as something like your football team or something you join, or like a single issue organisation, or something you join because you like it or because you like the leader, to be honest. And it was a problem with Corbynism that people joined because they liked Jeremy and they thought that's what it meant. What it meant to be a member of the Labour Party was liking the leader of the Labour Party. The Labour Party isn't any of those things. The Labour Party is a giant, it's a field of struggle. It's not your football team. It's the pitch on which your team has to play. Okay, so if you want to make an emotional investment in an organisation, based on your sort of ideology and commitment, by all means, join Momentum or join Labour First or join Progress or, join one of those organisations that has a fairly clearly defined ideology. But the Labour Party as such is just the terrain on which those different tendencies fight each other, and it always has been. And that's built into the kind of structure of our political party system, and it has been since 1900. So I just think, that's the only attitude. And if I just think it's just the wrong. It's no use to anybody to be a member of the Labour Party because they like the leader or don't like the leader. And I think to say, well, even Corbynism got defeated. Well, Corbynism was the most ambitious, project for the left within the Labour Party ever. So even Corbynism doesn't really work for me. Corbynism was never very likely to succeed. I would also say, look, what do we think is going to happen? The political left, lots of people have heard me say this lots of times before already, look, the political left was in complete abeyance in this country for more than 3 decades, really since the miners' strike. Between the miners' strike and 2015, there wasn't an organised political left in this country. There was tiny little fringe things like publications, Trotskyist groupuscles, little things that people like me would be involved with. And then there was a sort of sporadic wave of youth protests, basically, which never amounted, crystallised into any kind of significant organisational form. There was nothing. So to think that, we're going to go from that to actually having the most radical government in the history of the country in 4 or 5 years. That's not how history works. You know, it was always going to take longer than 5 years, and we were always going to meet resistance. Like within the party, we were always going to meet resistance for the project of, you know, taking over the Labour Party and using it as a vehicle, you know, for a completely different kind of political project to the one that it's been the vehicle for since the 1990s. So I just think if you thought it was going to be that easy, well, maybe, you know, maybe party politics isn't for you. But I think, you know, I think the reason for being involved is that being involved, you know, is not the only kind of, I mean, I would always say to anybody, the Labour Party politics is not sufficient. It's not the only kind of political engagement, and it's not for some people. I mean, it's fine if you really can't stand it. There's plenty of other things you can do. But the reason to do it is basically, if you don't involve yourself in the Labour Party, your political enemies will continue to involve themselves in the Labour Party, and they will continue to use it to suppress you. That's why you should continue to involve yourselves in the Labour Party. Yeah, I can see people saying, well, putting messages, we're living in an emergency, we can't wait. Well, then tell that to the right. Don't tell me that. Every time I say this, it's going to take a long time. Somebody puts a message saying, nobody says, oh, we were in a climate emergency, we can't wait. Don't tell me that. I can't help that. You know, tell our enemies that it's an emergency. You know, that's not a reason not to keep fighting those enemies. And those enemies, the dividing line between progressives and their enemies in this country runs through the Labour Party. You know, if you are outside of it, you are not on the front line of the fight between progressives and their enemies, basically.
Yeah, I really agree with what you're saying there, Jeremy. And I think there's a couple of, I think when people say even Corbynism failed, I think people were expecting parliamentary democracy to deliver a revolution, that everything would change overnight as long as Jeremy became Prime Minister, when actually all change involves, you know, chipping away at things, whether that's inside the party or outside, whether it's you know, organising in workplaces or communities, or passing motions at conference and selecting good candidates. You know, all of these things happen slowly until they happen quickly. And if you absent yourself halfway, or because there's been a setback, then you'll never see the fruition of those cumulative efforts to move the party left, or to move the country left. And I think that, you know, this is something that was not understood enough, and why so many members who joined under Corbyn left were not infused with that kind of spirit of community organising, and left as soon as it became unpalatable, and often left behind people who were halfway through some of these projects and some of these things that were being chipped away at. And you're right that when you do that, you weaken your comrades left behind, and you strengthen opponents who will stay and fight, and who in many cases have now won for the time being.
Thank you, Maddie. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Clive, but I was quite enjoying the sort of fighting spirit and kind of actually sense of some optimism, I would say, that was coming through from what Jeremy and Maddie were saying. And Maddie, I was just going to ask you, I was actually going to come to you anyway and just say, you know, could you maybe say a little more about, I mean, have you seen any successes in terms of that type of community organising that you're talking about, in terms of actually making a difference with what the party stands for, its ability to put out positive messages that engage with those movements outside the party, or are these sort of still rather half-done projects that have sometimes been abandoned now?
Yeah, so some people might be aware of the Living Rent Tenants Union in Scotland, which actually got born out of a kind of single issue campaign around legislation about assured tenancies in Scotland, and then kind of evolved into a tenants union, which is now carrying quite a lot for the left in Scotland, in terms of being the ones out knocking doors, running stalls, recruiting people, raising class consciousness through housing. And they published a model of rent controls in 2018, which members of Living Rent and Labour took into Scottish Labour Conference. It became Labour Party policy. It filtered through into legislation, which was sadly then watered down and voted against by our opponents in Parliament. But that growing consciousness through tenants union organising has affected the way that people understand collective action in Scotland and understand what representation of communities' needs mean for the Labour Party. And that's really exciting. And that was an example of people who were involved in the practical organising of, around a class issue and development of a policy platform, then using the Labour Party as a vehicle for the representation of that change. And, it wasn't ultimately successful because of the nature of parliamentary democracy, but it's still important that the party now recognises that collective as a force in Scotland, and those kinds of change, that kind of policy that was being advocated for has been largely normalised. So there's much to build on there, and so that's a really important example for me, and definitely something that I want to continue championing within the party.
Thank you, Maddie. And I think, I'm going to come back to issues around policy development perhaps, and the crucial issue of class and Labour space in a moment. But Clive, I wanted to give you a chance if you wanted to make a pitch for why progressive people should bother involving themselves in Labour politics. I think.
Oh, I think Jeremy answered it. The analogy I had in my head was from my childhood, which was flouncing off. I lost an argument about what game we were going to play between the two groups of us, and we lost the argument. I flounced off from playing out into my bedroom, and then tried to win the argument from my bedroom window, shouting down at everyone like we should be doing this, which is like they were just like, yeah, whatever. We're down here. We'll decide, and that's what it feels like. I think Jeremy's point was spot on. I hadn't heard him make that point before. I've heard him make a lot of points. I haven't heard that point. It's the vehicle through which that progressive change happens, and there are lots of different progressives with lots of different ideas about how you take that forward. And if you leave that field, if you leave that that pitch where you're playing, then you're back in the change rooms having a hot shower, and you're not part of what's going on there. So you can be on the sideline shouting in, but you're not part of the action. So and that people say, oh, that's really arrogant, Labour's finished and so on. But maybe, but it is the main vehicle through which that change can happen at the moment and is likely to happen in the future, unless it goes kaput and then we're kind of rebuilding from the bottom up. I think it's been articulated really well. You've got to be in the Labour Party, or you've got to be in the Labour Party. I think to have a say. And I look at a lot of the people on their bios and so on social media, formerly Labour, and they're some of the loudest shouters, the angriest people, and they're still talking about Labour, but they've got no say over it anymore. It's just really sad. We need you on the pitch.
Yeah, if it's important to be angry about, it's important enough to be part of.
Exactly. Yeah.
You should have that on a badge. I think that would make quite a good badge.
Election campaigns, I'm still in slogan mode.
Maddie, you talked to interesting examples about the policies around renting and tenancies. I don't know about you, but I feel like in the last couple of weeks, normal politics has kind of resumed. Normal politics in all its difficulties has sort of resumed with a bit of a bam, really. And we've actually now, we've got a legislative programme, a policy programme from the government on the table for the first time really in 3 years. We've also got, we had a question from the audience about Labour's policies, and it was just, we had lots of questions in this vein about how you actually stay and fight and where what you can actually achieve. So someone just asked simply, will Labour put forward more socialist policies? And I wanted to broaden that out and just to sort of mention, obviously we have the policy reviews coming up now. It's been announced this week. Do these policy review processes give you any hope of the development of a more visionary and radical policy programme? Should people be involving themselves in that, or is it more important that they should be doing other things if they are fighting within the Labour Party? Who wants to go first on that? Don't all rush. Clive, I'm going to come to you. Oh, it's Maddie. I'm going to come to you then.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say, it's always difficult to answer whether one person should be doing A or B, because one person should never be doing all of the things. That's the point of a collective, that we all do the things that we have time for and have interest in and strengths in. So I would never say that, you know, community organising is more important than policy processes, but I think it does depend on the way in which those policy development processes and reviews happen. So I was involved in the Scottish Policy Forum, which, you know, spent 2 years developing the manifesto that we had in the election that's just taken place. And that manifesto was our most radical since devolution, included some really exciting ideas, and the involvement of people from trade unions and from the left of the party was really important in just, you know, sticking up for ideas and brought, so for example, the idea of a national care service has been around in Scotland for a really long time. But what do we mean by that? Do we mean actually a publicly run, democratically run organisation, or do we just mean covering the costs of private institutions continuing to deliver care packages? Are we including hospice care within care service? You know, what are we still going to do thresholds for who needs care? Like, these are important questions that people who are really engaged in the change that matters to people should be raising in those processes. So it's important that these reviews do allow for membership democracy, so that people who are interested in these things and care about these things are there raising these issues. And then when it comes down to it, you know, the process in Scotland involved several rounds of voting on and amendments and so on. You know, you need the numbers. So people need to be putting themselves forward to participate in those reviews, to bring in those community organisations that I've talked about, or to bring in the trade unions who maybe don't have their own representation and so on. So, you know, yes, participation in these things matters. And when the party says that it will respect the outcome of these processes that it sets up, then we should be, you know, holding them to them and using that that commitment to those processes to hold them to the decisions that are made by the membership. And I think that one of the things that went wrong in Scotland in this most recent election was we had this incredible manifesto that I was really proud to be standing on, but we allowed the party leadership to start talking about a national recovery plan. And the National Recovery Plan wasn't the whole manifesto. It was a random selection of our least exciting policies that somebody had decided was more palatable for the Scottish electorate. And that became our National Recovery Plan, the thing that we were prioritising. We didn't get to talk about all the other exciting stuff in our manifesto. So it is important that people engage in these policy processes, and it is important that people know what the party is standing for, so that when it is good, we can platform it and fight for it and tell people about it. As you know, as Jeremy said, when we're running left-wing campaigns, they do better locally. So yeah, I think there's still lots to engage with.
I was going to thank you, Maddie, and Clive, I was going to turn to you and see, I mean, do you have anything to add to what Maddie said? She made a pretty good case for involving ourselves in these processes. I'll just say I'm not a party member. I'm one of those people, sorry, used to be.
Yeah, so I think that, so one of the things, as you mentioned, my very brief bid for leadership, we named the brief but beautiful manifesto Transform to Change, and at its heart was a kind of the sense that you had to be the change you wanted to see. And so in that change was about making sure that we democratize ourselves, that we were the kind of society and economy we wanted to see. We had to change the culture of our own party to be able to talk about that with authenticity. And so I would say, if you're going to be talking about a new political economy, you're talking about a Green New Deal, sustainability, a well-being economy. You're thinking about an internationalism, because the problems facing us are international. We can see with COVID, with the climate crisis. So it's an all-encapsulating economic model which is transformative, but at its heart, I think, has to be democracy. So economic democracy, democracy in terms of our constitution, in terms of pooled sovereignty, not just for nations, but for regions. And I think it's a completely radical take on looking at the problems of the world and then how we deal with them. If you think about AI, if you think about our data, if you think about, for example, algorithmic problems in terms of the labour market now, with people enslaved almost. I think that was the term that was used in a report from the Institute for the Future of Work today, by these programs. You can begin to see that democracy and the erosion of that democracy is increasingly something that's important. So I think if you look at the problems, if you look at what the future holds, if you look at where the Conservative Party are heading in terms of this kind of crony Keynesianism, but with this kind of neo-illiberal approach of growing authoritarianism, anti-democratic, handing power to big tech, setting off our data, which has massive implications for all of us. And you can begin to see the kind of, I think, quite grim dystopian future they have planned for us. So I think if Labour wants to pursue a genuinely transformative socialist programme, and I'm not saying that it does, but let's just say it's transformative in a progressive way, then I think that programme needs to be, I think, communicated and decided not just by the usual set of bureaucrats in a room who then come out and hand down that policy, whatever it is. It needs to come from the ground up. We need to consult with people. We need to talk to people. We need to hear what those ideas, that creativity, that thinking is out there. There's lots of it. And that way we'll have a stronger position. It'll have more, it'll be far better imbued with those who helped have input into it. It'll be stronger, and it will be, we'll be living our politics in the way that we've put it forward. So I kind of really think there's an opportunity if the policy review wants to adopt the kind of transformative policies and cultural changes that the Labour Party needs to see. If it doesn't, then I'm afraid to say, to me, it will look like a bunch of people in a room that have decided that this is the future. And that, for me, will be a failure at the first hurdle.
Thank you very, very much, Clive. And I'm going to come to you in a moment, Jeremy, but I just wanted to kind of bring in a bit of another thread that's been sort of much discussed in the post-election analysis. And I do apologise for this, but I'm going to quote Matthew Goodwin at you. So the idea that people simply don't care, you can have all the great policies in the world, people simply don't care. You've heard it all. Matthew Goodwin summarised this as saying that he says the new fault line is the one separating cosmopolitans and traditionalists, which has little to do with class and much more to do with people's age, education, and their geography. And it is values that are doing the heavy lifting. So people don't really care about, their material circumstances, really. It's all about values these days. Jeremy, why is he wrong?
Values is a meaningless term. It's a completely meaningless term. It doesn't explain anything. Our values are, in discourse of people like Goodwin and a lot of other people at the moment, this term values gets used, but they don't explain where value, they sort of have a notion of where values come from, but they don't have any explanation of the mechanism of why. Well, why does age and education, etc., produce an apparently different set of values? And my answer would be, people do not vote according to some abstract notion of values. They also do not vote for abstract policy programs. They don't vote for abstract images, or narratives, or the things, or frames, or the things that those people think they vote for. Well, they vote according to their perceived interests. And values are essentially a way of, now we live, English political culture is notoriously moralistic in its language, both at the level of kind of high politics and at kind of level of everyday discourse. So people will say, they'll tell focus group researchers, they'll talk to them in a kind of moralistic language. But I think you go and look at the research, you go and look at the data those people are usually using or you look at the kind of survey questions they're basing it on. They're very superficial, and they don't really interrogate what people mean by things like patriotism or, family or whatever. You actually dig into it. I think what people are motivated by is a perceived set of interest. The best, I think, so yeah, there's a big age fault line in politics, but the clearest fault line in politics is between people who own property and people who don't. There's two sets of fault lines. There's people who have mortgages, people who rent, and people who've paid off their mortgages. And the people who've paid off their mortgages and are people who are living on pensions are very likely to vote Conservative. That it has been the case since the beginning of universal suffrage that if you had paid off your mortgage and you were living off investments, you were going to vote Conservative. It doesn't matter what you did in a previous life. It doesn't matter, what your accent is. Your material interests at that point are essentially aligned with landlords and bankers. That's what you're living. That's where your money's coming from. There's been this kind of absurd kind of sleight of hand, carried out in public discourse recently, where the phrase like working class is now used to designate people who don't work, who haven't worked for years, and they're counterposed. They're distinguished from people who are supposedly middle class because they've got degrees, who've just entered the labour market. People who are going to be completely dependent on selling their labour, like for decades, but they're somehow defined as not working class. I mean, and I think. I think at the same time, so I think it's not at all surprising that people whose material interests are now either or objectively or are perceived as being aligned with the ruling class, the capitalist class, they express their sense of political belonging and their sense of political hopes in very conservative language and a kind of conservative cultural language. But I would say very crudely, if people decide they're really into Churchill and flags and Boris, when they perceive on some level that they are now part of a kind of establishment that includes at its top, the City of London and the aristocracy, but also sort of includes them, because they're not workers, they're not living off wages, they're not dependent upon trade unions, like guaranteeing their wages for their prosperity, and their pensions are all invested in the stock market, and the rising value of their homes is what's describing. I can see somebody disagreeing in the column. Well, if you disagree, you're going to have to explain, because you're disagreeing because this doesn't apply to all old people. That's true, but it does apply to the vast majority. That's just statistical reality. So I think it's this. I think that. I think this notion of, I think you can say exactly the same thing, for example, about liberal graduates. Again, the kind of the standard line which Goodwin is reproducing there, which also gets reproduced by more liberal commentators about, about why, young graduates in the work market are cosmopolitan. They don't have any account of it. Their account of it is generally just this kind of notion that somehow going to university turns you into a liberal. Like university is just a sort of liberal producing machine. They don't have any account. There are really basic material reasons. Like if you're a graduate, if your interests are now aligned with the broad globalized knowledge economy, that is what you have to sell now. You have your kind of cultural status, you have a specialized set of knowledge. Of course you're going to be more cosmopolitan. It's not just because you've been taught to be a good liberal by going to university. It's because your material interests are now aligned in a sort of different way. So this conception, no, I think this narrative, which is promoted both by sort of conservatives and liberals in different ways at the moment, this narrative according to which everything is all about liberals now. It isn't about class. It's just complete nonsense. I mean, it depends. I mean, and I think actually one of the things that's really interesting. I mean, one of the problems is the way in which we talk about class, for example, in mainstream political discourse in this country, isn't a Marxist way of talking about class. It's derived from the Weberian tradition, and it has a lot of value to it. I'm not someone who would dismiss that tradition, but it understands the concept of class as basically designating occupational status groups. That's what it means. Okay, it means what is the general sort of widespread socially understood position of your particular occupation group in some imagined hierarchy. And so therefore, if you're a university professor, you're very high up because you're supposed to have all this sort of status. And if you're doing manual work, you're not high up, even though as a plumber, you might well be earning twice as much as like a university lecturer, for example. And the classical Marxist model, which also has problems, has limitations, but also has considerable explanatory power, says, look, what defines class is your position in the relations of production. What that means is, are you dependent upon investments and employing other people for your income, or on the value of assets, or are you dependent on selling your labour? And the fact is that amongst people who are currently dependent on selling their labour, Firstly, it's not true that Labour has lost their votes. If you remove retired people from all the kind of surveys and from the election, if retired people couldn't vote, Labour would have won in 2019, would have won in 2017.
And I think, can I just, sorry to cut you off mid-flow, Jeremy, but can I just interject, because I think it's something that I think you wrote about, correct me if I'm wrong, which is that the current definition of working class, using the sort of classic A, B, C to C, D, E categorizations, actually very much skews working class towards retired and older people because of the nature of the occupations that they used to do.
Yeah, well, look, it's partly because of occupations and partly because of income. So if you've got a pension income of like 10 grand a year, but you've got a house which you've completely paid off the mortgage on, which is going up in value by like 20 grand a year, you're measured, you're counted as being low income. So you're counted as being being relatively low income. So they have all these statistics about how Labour has lost all this support among low income people, but they don't include asset wealth in those criteria normally. So you're right, yeah. So that's the point.
I mean, I think
that's a question. I mean, I'm on the panel and I'm asking a question. But Jeremy, we know capitalism has periodic crises. So I guess the question I would like is asking is are we kind of, barring kind of political alliances, progressive alliances and other changes, are we kind of relying on some kind of economic downturn so that those people's material economic security is seen as endangered? It's happened on the Tories' watch, and therefore there is an opportunity for Labour to kind of take those votes back. Is that what we're relying on? Because that's kind of quite deterministic, isn't it? And
well, my view is like the pensioners, that they're not coming back. You know, the Tories have made clear they'll do anything to protect their interests and defend them. They're not coming back to us. And also the Tories and also New Labour have engineered a situation where people, I mean, I don't hate people for making this decision. Look, if you're 65 now, it's not like being 65 even 20 years ago. You know, if you're 65 now, you're looking at expecting to be alive for another 20 years. The social care system is in a shambles. There's nothing you can do. You can see the social infrastructure has been dying for decades, and your children and grandchildren are in a very precarious situation. The only thing you can hope to do for your children and grandchildren is leave them the property that you've accumulated. So you're going to vote for the party which defends the interests of property holders. You are going to. I just think it's a complete idea. Of course, Labour should be, for example, promoting, as we should have been doing for decades, as even, you know, I remember Andy Burnham, to his credit, has been talking about this since the 2010 Labour leadership election, a national care service. Of course we should. Of course we should be promoting the idea that people shouldn't have to see their house as their pension and as their only guarantee of not like dying, dying in penury and suffering in infirmity in their later years. We should be promoting that. But there's no way within the next 10 years we're getting the pensioners' votes back. It's not happening. We need to put together a social coalition and an electoral coalition which is made up of other people. That is why the strategy being pursued by the current leadership is a complete dead end. Because these people are not going to start voting Labour because we wave a flag at them. Because the reason they're voting Tory is not really because of the flag. It's because the Tories are going to protect their positions as property holders. And they are going to. And because that is the only function and purpose of the Conservative Party, and has been since it came into its modern form, in the 1920s. So
I just wanted to jump in because I'm very conscious that we're running out of time and there's so much of interest that's being discussed. But a couple of you have mentioned the issue of a progressive alliance or coalitions. That was the issue on which we have more questions than anything else, I would say, from our readers. And just, what would it take? We've just got a couple of minutes left. What would, kind of coming back to the practical, what if we're not going to just wait for, demographics to shift and have any prospect of getting, Labour performing better in the polls and in elections before, say, 2030? What would it take to get them to agree some kind of progressive alliance? Is there any? We've got 2 by-elections coming up in England, one where Lib Dems are by far the largest local party, one where Labour is in Batley and Spen. Is there any prospect of anything happening there anytime soon? What would it take for them to agree what seems so self-evident to, I think, all of us? I'd be interested in hearing Maddie's views as well, and to so many of our readers.
I think the house burning down around Norwich is, quite frankly, legit. It's just that, I mean, the roof kind of the struts kind of flaming struts flying onto your head. I really do think that at the moment. And there are still people inside the Labour movement who are just, we can turn this around, despite, you know, Scotland off and not coming back for Labour anytime soon. I just don't think people quite understand. And it's really interesting listening to Jeremy there, because I remember being on the doorstep in 2017, and the thing that came back, I remember knocking on voters who had been Labour, then had gone to either Tory or Brexit Party, knocking on their door, and the issue of the triple lock and the death tax, whatever it was, came up, and they came back to Labour. And I know there's something in that, you know, and I can see that from my direct experience. And that, you know, Theresa May was hammered. I remember she made that when that came out, when that policy came out. So I think arguably there is a sea change taking place in the Labour Party. I think let's have a look. I think the linchpin is proportional representation. You know, speaking to the Greens at the moment, they're having a good time at the moment. They're on an upward trajectory after a few years in the doldrums, and in the long term, their trajectory has been going up. But I think they're in a position now where they're like, we had the door slammed in our face in 2017. We don't really want to talk overtly about Progressive Alliance at the moment. We want to make as many gains as we can, and if that's at your expense, then so be it. And so I think ultimately no one is going to trust the Labour Party if it comes and says, hey, we want to work with you, help us get over the line, and then we'll look after you. Ain't going to happen. There's going to have to be a fundamental commitment to changing the electoral system and then coming up with something, because the SNP are going to have to be part of any supplying confidence government that can change the electoral voting system and the constitution. And that means ultimately, you know, having something to say on the constitution, a third option which is viable and isn't simply just about the union where we are now, or some kind of devolution which is about doling out sovereignty on a lease until you change your mind. Scotland isn't going to fall for that again. So, you know, in my opinion, that's what needs to happen. And until we do that, we're stuck in this quagmire.
Maddie, you're shaking your head. I was going to come to you. Obviously, the debates around PR are quite different in Scotland. And, you know, I mean, PR hasn't been obviously different issues. PR hasn't been the salvation of the Labour Party in Scotland so far, or indeed in other countries in Europe. So I don't know. Anyway, feel free to come back in on any of those points.
I mean, there was lots that I wanted to come back in there, particularly around the nature of class and identity. You know, speaking as a disabled women trade unionist, there's lots to say there about who we're speaking to and why. But I guess specifically on that question around the constitution that Clive's just touched upon, I would really caution against the Labour Party pursuing any form of third option. There's been a lot of talk about this very recently, which is part of the problem, that there are some really exciting ideas being talked about in terms of constitutional change that is needed in the UK, whether it's abolition of the House of Lords, proportional representation, or even abolition of the monarchy. But none of this was pursued with any vigour after 2014. And people who are speaking about it now just look like, you know, they're coming up with ideas to mollify a nationalist movement that regards itself as progressive in Scotland. And we saw what happened when we stood against that in 2014 in collaboration with the Conservatives. And I think even describing it as a third option makes it sound like a wrecking tactic. You know, in reality, it would be a two-fold vote, a vote for or against change, and then for what type of change. But calling it a third option just makes it sound like you're trying to split the vote for change. And I also think that very few people outside of Scotland are actually talking about this. And there are, you know, when we're talking about what constitutional change the UK needs, it can't just be Scottish activists talking about it. And at the moment, we've got Gordon Brown swanning around asking for positive, pragmatic and patriotic approaches to the union, as though that's going to help. And I'm just really concerned that going down this avenue is going to make us look like we're just trying to wreck calls for independence. And I'm not saying that we should support independence, and I'm not saying that we should oppose independence, but I don't think that a third option is fooling anybody.
Thank you. I'm going to need to wrap up. I see the last comment. Gordon Brown is so completely irrelevant, one of our readers. Jeremy, did you have any closing comments? There's a lot that's just come up in the last few minutes. you have any closing comments you wanted to make?
No, I agree with what Clive and Maddie have said. I think Maddie's points about the third option are really well taken. But I think, well, obviously, the Progressive Alliance is just as, everybody knows what I think about that. The Progressive Alliance is just a no-brainer. I think the thing I always take the opportunity to say this because it needs saying that again and again and again. Look, we don't, especially Labour Party members and supporters in this country, they have this notion that we live in a political environment which is incredibly hostile to Labour, and they like to sort of huddle together and cling to their identity as Labour Party people. I was watching the campaign group rally yesterday. I regard myself as absolutely in the kind of political orbit of the campaign group, but what nearly every person talking at that, every MP was just saying was basically, if we go home and grit our teeth and wish hard enough, we'll get socialism eventually. And the problem is, that is a sort of misconception. We don't just live in a sort of anti-Labour polity. We live in an incredibly pro-Tory polity. The Tories have been in government for like 80% nearly of the period of universal suffrage. Like, if we don't behave, and Labour just doesn't behave like a political party in a country where its main opponent has won 80% of the time. It behaves like it's still 1960, and like for the past 20, we still behave like it's 1968, and like for the past 20 years, for the only time in history, there's been a roughly equal balance of support in the press, and there's been a kind of alternation between Labour and Tory. Labour still behaves like that's the country it lives in. That we were only ever that country for 20 years. We haven't been that country for my entire lifetime. I'm nearly 50, and we've got to stop behaving like we're in this country where we've got an even shot. We've got a good chance of like beating the Tories. We don't. It's virtually a one-party state, and we have to address that.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm really sorry I've committed the cardinal sin as a chair of allowing us to run slightly over time, but I just feel like this is such an antidote, frankly, listening to the radical progressives being quite sensible, I would say, and a good mixture of theory and practice.
Or relative.
It's such a good antidote to, I quite agree with you, Jeremy, I do apologise for quoting Matthew Goodwin, I think you're right, that has spread across the liberal media as well, this idea that we are just in this very simplistic battle where we no longer have to talk about material conditions, and we're just in a battle of the English patriots versus the woke, and who even talks about what role Scotland plays in that. When in fact, I think I saw a poll that said that 2% of people thought that the problem with Labour was that it was too woke. So I'm not sure most people still even really know what that phrase means. Tony Blair told us this week that everyone knows what it means, but I'm not totally convinced. Anyway, I won't ramble on. I'm so glad that you could all join us, everyone, and I'm so glad that everyone listening at home could join us. I'm sorry I didn't get around to more of the questions. There were so many coming in that were really good. I have put some links up, if you scroll back up slightly in this chat, to our live discussions, which we have every Thursday at 5. Next week, we are discussing the crisis in Palestine and the actions of the Israeli government. So that will be a really important one. Please do register on that link, and you can also sign up to support us to make more of these events possible and hear hopefully some balance to some of the other media. So it just remains for me to thank our panelists once again, and I hope to see some of you